I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. We are privileged to have with us Bridget Jeffries, and Bridget has been part of our church. I'm not going to get this if I don't put on my glasses. Bridget has been part of DeerGrove Covenant Church since 2009, so she has been with us quite a while. I did not know about this, but Bridget is a civil employee of the Illinois State Police. So that is where she spends her daytime working. But on the side, and her avocation, I think, is probably, she is a writer who has been published in Relevant magazine, in the Priscilla papers, and The Hill. She's also, because of interest in her degree, which I'll talk about in a minute, she's been interviewed by the Washington Post and Public Broadcasting Religion and Ethics News Weekly. Presently, Bridget is working on a PhD in church history at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, hoping to go on to education, teaching, and perhaps some research. So she has been a busy woman. You can see that in her resume. She also attends church with her husband, Varden, and her kids, Harley, Constantine, and Lyra. So we are thankful to have her with us this morning, and right after our offering song, she will come up and bring us the message.
Well, good morning, DeerGrove. As Pastor Rick said, I have been attending DeerGrove since 2009. So some of you probably know me pretty well, but some of you don't. So I thought I'd start out by telling you that tomorrow is actually one of my favorite days of the year, because tomorrow is one of the only times of the year that an adult can get away with dressing as someone or something that they are not. So one year I had this employer, they told us October 31st, no costumes. You're not allowed to wear costumes to work. So I said, okay, I didn't wear a costume. I just happened to come into work in a red trench coat and a red fedora. So just happened to be wearing that day. And my coworker looks at me and she says, "Are you dressed as Carmen Sandiego?" And I told her, I could neither confirm nor deny that I am at work dressed as Carmen Sandiego. And she said, "Aren't you afraid you'll get caught?" And I said, "No, dressed like this, they won't be able to find me." So later, my husband Varden came into my life, and I'm just a little bit taller than Varden. So I decided to have some fun with that. I decided we weren't going to try to hide that. So one year, we dressed as Roger and Jessica Rabbit. And I wore the highest heels that I could find, and it was a lot of fun. I like to goof around. So there's this comic book and TV show that I like called The Tick. Has anyone heard of The Tick? Okay, Mark's heard of The Tick. But it's about this giant blue muscle-bound guy, and he runs around with this little nerdy guy in a white, it looks like a bunny suit, it's actually a moth suit. He runs around with this little nerdy, bespectacled man named Arthur. And so I was like, "Hey, Varden, I have a great idea. How do you feel about unitards?" So the next year, this was our costume. Okay, and there is no greater love there is no greater proof that that man over there loves me than this picture right here. Greater love hath no man than that he wear a white unitard in public for his wife. So I like October 31st because of the costumes. But these costumes were actually not the greatest stunt that I pulled on October 31st. The greatest stunt that I ever pulled on October 31st was actually this. 10 years ago tonight, this is a Facebook post from 10 years ago tonight, October 31st, 2012, and it says, "Happy Reformation Day. I just celebrated my Protestant heritage by posting a copy of Martin Luther's 95 Theses on the door of the local Roman Catholic Church." So, on October 31st, 2012, I printed out a copy of this thing called the 95 Theses by Martin Luther. And I went to the local Catholic church very late at night, around midnight, and I left the document on their door. And I want you to know two things about this. One is that I was very careful to use very gentle, sticky stuff. Like I didn't want some poor priest to be scraping something off of his church door all morning. I wanted him to just be able to take it down easily. So I tried to be nice about this. And I left a note on the back of the document saying, I hope they know this is all in good fun, and I get that it's not the 16th century anymore, and Catholics and Protestants can be friends now. But I didn't leave my name because I was scared. So they're probably still wondering who did that. Hopefully they don't see this. Anyway, why did I do that? Who is Martin Luther? What are the 95 Theses? And what does any of this have to do with October 31st? Well, if you don't know the history of the Evangelical Covenant Church, our denomination was actually founded by Swedish Lutherans. So you see on this tree, this is from the Evangelical Covenant Church website, we've got Martin Luther, 1517. Then we've got the Lutheran branch. Then we've got the Covenant branch coming off of that. So Martin Luther is a pretty direct part of our heritage. I mean, all Protestants kind of come from Martin Luther. But what happened was Martin Luther, he was this German monk, and he was a theology professor at the University of Wittenberg. And it is believed, we're not sure of this date, but it is believed that on October 31st, 1517, he went to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, and he posted the 95 Theses on Indulgences, and that is what launched the Protestant Reformation. Now, if you don't know much about Martin Luther, if you don't know much about the Reformation, if you don't know much about your own heritage, if you're covenant, you're sitting here and you're like, Bridget, what's an indulgence? Well, that's why you need to come to my class. But basically, indulgences were the grace of God for sale, for money. And Martin Luther took issue with people selling the grace of God for money, and that is how the Reformation got started. But since we're going to talk about Martin Luther in my class in 2 weeks, today I wanted to talk about another Reformation, and it's a Reformation that happened in the Bible, and that's Huldah and Josiah's Reformation. So Martin Luther's Reformation, that happened in the 16th century AD, about 505 years ago now. But I want to take you back to the 7th century BC, all the way back to a period that was known as the divided monarchy, back to the reign of the kings. In the passage that we're about to talk about, the 12 tribes that Moses had brought up out of Egypt, they were not one anymore. They were divided. They were split into 2 kingdoms. And Israel or Samaria, that's the northern kingdom up there. And Judah is the southern kingdom, and that's where Jerusalem is located. It's got Jerusalem. And we're going to talk about Josiah. Now, Josiah was the king of the southern kingdom, and he was 8 years old when he became king. I don't know about you guys, but I've had 2 children pass through the age of 8, and I wouldn't put them in charge of very much. But Josiah here, he's 8 years old, and he's running an entire kingdom. So Josiah became king, and he inherited problems that had nothing to do with him. People were not seeking God. There were these monuments to other gods called Asherah poles, to a goddess named Asherah. There were these places called high places. They were basically these elevated pieces of land where people would worship other gods. And there were idols, lots and lots of idols, none of which had anything to do with Josiah. He inherited these problems. He didn't start them. But the text tells us in verse 3, in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, so he's 16 years old at this point, he's 16 years old, Josiah began to seek the God of his father David. So I want you to observe that reform was a process for Josiah. He didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm going to fix Judah. It started with kind of this inward seeking. He started with himself. He started seeking after God. He wasn't just like, you know what, I'm going to go smash some Asherah poles today. That sounds fun. I'm going to read to you verses 3b through 7. In his 12th year, so now he's age 20, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, and idols. Under his direction, the altars of the Baals were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles and the idols. Did I mention that these other gods, they had priests that served them? These he broke, so the idols he broke to pieces and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of the priests on their altars. You guys, Josiah's not playing around. He is not kidding around. He means business. And so he purged Judah and Jerusalem and the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon as far as Naphtali and in the ruins around them. He tore down the altars and the Asherah poles and crushed the idols to powder and cut to pieces all the incense altars throughout Israel. Then he went back to Jerusalem. So I don't know about you guys, but I feel like right now Josiah's doing pretty good for, what was he, 20? He's doing pretty good for a 20-year-old. He's undertaken to reform Judah, and he's doing pretty good. I mean, some of us in the room are a little bit older than 20, right? Some of us are a lot older than 20. When you were 20, had you smashed even one Asherah pole? I'll bet you hadn't. So it would have been easy for Josiah to say, you know what, I'm doing pretty good. I don't need reform. I don't need correction. I don't need rebuke. I don't need guidance. I'm on a roll here. Have you seen me? But Josiah wasn't done. His heart was still open to reform. So the text continues. Now the temple was in a state of disrepair, basically. The temple that Solomon had built, that had not been, there was no upkeep on it. So that was in a state of disrepair. In the 18th year of Josiah's reign, so he's 26 years old now, to purify the land and the temple, he sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, and Maaseiah, the ruler of the city, with Joah, son of Joahaz, the recorder, to repair the temple of the Lord his God. And verses 9 through 13 tell us that Josiah sent these workers to Hilkiah, the high priest, and they renovated and they restored the temple. And it's while they were renovating the temple of the Lord that they run into a problem. Now, do you guys ever watch those shows like Love It or List It or those home improvement shows? And there's someone on the show who's like, okay, I've got an $80,000 budget. I want to knock down this wall. I want an open concept kitchen. I want a reflecting pool in my backyard. I want one of those libraries like in Beauty and the Beast with a ladder that rolls down the book. Okay, this might be my wish list, okay? But they have this list, they have this plan for how they're going to renovate their house, how they're going to reform their house. They have a plan. But do things ever go according to plan on those shows? No, they never do. The workers get in there and they start knocking down walls. And what do they find out? They're like, you got mold in your walls. We got to take $10,000 of your budget now, and we got to fix the mold, and things are not going to go according to plan. Well, Josiah is literally renovating the temple here. And things are about to not go according to plan because they're going to find something that's going to tell them that Judah's got spiritual mold in its walls, and he's going to have to address it. So I'm going to read these verses. While they were bringing out the money that had been taken into the temple of the Lord, Hilkiah, the priest, found the book of the law of the Lord that had been given through Moses. And Hilkiah, he gives the book to his secretary, who gives the book of the law of the Lord to the king. And they read it to 26-year-old King Josiah. They're like, hey, king, you got to check this out. And even though Josiah has been seeking after God's heart, religion in Judah has been in a state of decline and disrepair, just like the temple has. And he's done what he can, but he didn't know what he didn't know. And this is the first time he's ever seen the book of the law of the Lord given through Moses. They didn't have printing presses back then. Books were very cumbersome to copy. There wouldn't have been a ton of copies. He's never seen the book of the law of the Lord that's been given through Moses. So even though he's been trying to seek after God, he hasn't been doing the things that were written in the book. And he knows that despite his best efforts, he has not been doing these things that Moses told him to do. And his people have not been doing what Moses told him to do. And the text tells us, when the king heard the words of the law, he tore his robes. He is distraught about this. So he gathers the high priest, Hilkiah, and his advisors, and he tells them, go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the remnant in Israel and Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that is poured out on us, because those who have gone before us have not kept the word of the Lord. They have not acted in accordance with all that is written in this book. Now I'm sitting here like, wait a second, Josiah, why are you upset about this? You didn't do these things. You're not in trouble here, right? You're not responsible for what came before you. You couldn't help that. But Josiah doesn't see that. He doesn't see it that way. He's connected to his history. He takes responsibility for it. He knows that we are connected to the past. We can never get away from the past. That's something that I, as a historian in training, try to drill to people. We are connected to our past. And even if we didn't do the sins of the past, we're still responsible for fixing them. So Josiah basically says to his advisors, look, you guys, we need a bat phone to God. Who do we know that has a bat phone to God? And it just so happens that there were people in Judah and in Israel at that time who had bat phones to God, so to speak, and those were the prophets who speak for God. So Hilkiah and company, they go to speak with one particular prophet, verse 22. Hilkiah and those the king had sent with him went to speak to the prophet Huldah, who was the wife of Shallum, the son of Tokath, the son of Hazrah, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new quarter. Now I want you guys to know there were male prophets in Jerusalem at this time. Both Jeremiah and Zephaniah, you might have heard of them, they have books in your Bible. They were active in Judah at this time. They could have gone to Jeremiah, they could have gone to Zephaniah, but they didn't. Why did they go to Huldah? We don't know because the text doesn't tell us. But some people believe they went to Huldah, a woman, on purpose because they thought that she would be more merciful and compassionate and more likely to intercede with God, intercede with them on behalf of them with God rather than Jeremiah or Zephaniah. The text doesn't tell us that. That's speculation. But it is a really curious feature of this story that they chose to put themselves under Huldah's teaching and authority rather than putting themselves under Jeremiah's or Zephaniah's. So here's what Huldah tells them. And you guys can be the judge. Does she show more mercy and compassion to them because she's a woman? This is what the Lord says. I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people. All the curses written in the book that has been read in the presence of the king of Judah, because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and aroused my anger by all their hands have made, the idols, my anger will be poured out on this place and will not be quenched. So the first part of Huldah's words are not merciful and reassuring. What Huldah basically says is actions have consequences. Actions are going to have consequences. There were actions that came before you. Things have been set in motion. There are going to be consequences. All that history that has gone before Josiah, all those things that he couldn't help, Huldah upholds what is written in the book of Moses, that sins have consequences. But Huldah's not done yet. She does have a word of mercy for Josiah. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before God when you heard what he spoke against this place and its people, and because you humbled yourself before me and tore your robes and wept in my presence, I have heard you, declares the Lord. Now I will gather you to your ancestors and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I'm going to bring on this place and on those who live here. Now, I don't want to go into the exegetical history of this passage. Pastor Rick told you that I'm a historian. I'm actually an exegetical historian. I study the history of passages and how people read them and how they responded to them and how they interacted with them. And I can tell you, this passage here has confused and confounded commentators for generations. Because the thing about Christians is Christians are very good at not being teachable to people who don't look like them or to people who are not like them. And for the history of the church, Christians have been pretty good about setting up these walls where they refuse to be taught or preached to by certain types of people. And one of those types of people were women. They didn't want to be taught by women. They didn't want to be preached to by women. So they come to this passage and they're confused and they're confounded because they're like, what is this woman doing preaching in my Bible? But I want you to observe who was not confused or confounded by it. Hilkiah and Josiah. Hilkiah is the high priest. Josiah is the king. They could have been like, lady, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are to talk to the high priest like that? You're a woman. You're a woman. Come on, you know what? We're done with you. Let's go get Jeremiah and Zephaniah on the phone. We're not going to listen to this. Let's get a second opinion. But they don't do that. They accept her words as the word of the Lord. And it's cold comfort. It's cold comfort. She basically says, God has heard you. He is going to show mercy to you, but things are going to go astray after you're gone. But they accept it, and they take that back to Josiah the king. And I think that part of the reason, and I want you to observe about this part right here, they were teachable. That's what I want you to take away from this scene right here. They were teachable. They probably knew that a donkey, there's this part in the Bible where a donkey speaks the true word of the Lord. There's this other part in the Bible that came after them where it says the rocks can speak the word of the Lord. And these men accepted that this woman, someone with lower social and cultural standing than them in Judah, they accepted that this woman could speak the word of the Lord to them. They were teachable. And they were willing to be taught by someone who might have otherwise been less than them. The remainder of this chapter and the next chapter, they continue with Josiah's reforms. Josiah doesn't stop because of this. He calls an assembly of the people, and he reads to them from this book of Moses. And he has the people pledge themselves to God. He's trying to save them. He knows if God has showed mercy on them, if they stick to God, maybe God will show mercy on them. He has them pledge themselves to the God of their ancestors. And then in the next chapter, he restores the Passover. Israelites, Judahites, they had not been observing the Passover like the book of Moses told them to. He restores the Passover, and we see it still being celebrated in Jesus' time. But we know, looking back from our place in history, we know that Huldah was a true prophet. She spoke the truth. Josiah later did not listen to God. He fought in a battle that another prophet had told him not to fight in, and he perished at the age of 39. But he was remembered because of his reforms, because of turning his heart to God, because of all the changes he made, because of how he fought his history. He is remembered as the last righteous king of Judah. But not 100 years later, calamity fell on Judah. They fell to Nebuchadnezzar, and they fell into the hands of foreign nations. And they were still in the hands of foreign nations when Jesus came. And obviously, we're going to be talking about Advent in a couple of weeks, and the coming of Jesus. So there's three things that I want us to take away from Josiah and Huldah's Reformation. And the first one is this: be teachable. Be willing to be taught by people who don't look like you. Be willing to be taught by the opposite gender. Be willing to be taught by people younger than you, by people older than you. Be willing to be taught by people less educated or less intelligent than you. Later in the New Testament, we are told, in humility, consider others better than yourselves. I have a little story about my son, Constantine. He's 9 years old now, but he was 4 years old at the time, and he's autistic. My other daughter, Harley, she's 16 now, but she also has a disability. And one day I had no patience for Harley. I can't remember what she had done, but she was not listening to me, and I was out of patience with her. And I was yelling at her, and I was scolding her. And Costa marches into the room, and he says, he's 4 years old, autistic toddler. He says, "Mom, you don't have to get mad at Harley." And I'm like, "Costa, she's not listening to me." And he's like, "Well, you don't have to get mad at her." And I'm like, oh man, I'm not going to take this from an autistic 4-year-old. I am not having this today. And I'm just like, "Costa, this is none of your business." And Constantine kind of looks at me and he says, "Well, you're not making very good choices." And he spins around and he marches out of the room. And I just stared after him in shock and disbelief. I had not taught him the language of choices, bad choices. Someone else in his life had. And I was like, I've looked at Varden and I'm like, who is this child? I was just completely shocked though, because I knew that he was right. I knew that my little autistic 4-year-old child was right. Because my older child has a disability and she needs patience and she needs understanding. And I was not showing her patience and understanding that day. So God used this little autistic 4-year-old to rebuke me and to speak a true word to me. Martin Luther, who we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, he actually didn't set out to become a monk. I mean, the Reformation happened because he was a monk, but he actually set out to become a lawyer. His father wanted him to become a lawyer. I don't think we would have had the Reformation if Martin Luther was a lawyer, no offense, lawyers. But that was back when being a lawyer actually made a lot of money. And he was riding home on horseback in a thunderstorm, and a bolt of lightning almost struck him, and it terrified him. Now, these are his own words later on in his life when he's telling his life story. This bolt of lightning almost struck him. It terrified him. He cried out, but he didn't cry out to God. He cried out to St. Anna, who was considered Mary's mother. He cried out to St. Anna because she was the patron saint of minors. And he cried out, "Help St. Anna, I will become a monk." He basically said, "St. Anna, if you help me, I will become a monk." Now, later in his life, he would rebuke that theology. He would say, "Don't pray to saints. There's no theology for praying to saints." Yet, isn't it odd that God kind of took this false idea of praying to saints, and he used it, this bad theology of praying to saints, and he used it to put Martin Luther on the path to the Reformation. Because God can use anything to speak a true word, and God can use anything to put us on our path. The second thing I want you to take away from this is this: reform yourself. Our Lord Jesus Christ taught us, clean the inside of the cup. Josiah, he didn't start with Judah, he started with himself. Look for something in your own life this week that needs to be given over to God and give it up. It can be more time spent in prayer. It can be not spending money on that thing you always spend money on. It can be having more patience with your children. It could be a sin that you've known you need to give up, but so far you just haven't given it up. So I'm not going to name names. I think I'll get in trouble if I name names. If you talk to me later, I'll name names. But we are living in an age of so many Christian scandals. We are living in an age where so many Christian leaders, pastors, apologists, seminary presidents, biblical scholars, they are guilty. They have been living with spiritual mold in their walls. They have been living with secret sexual sins, or they have been living with the sin of abusing the people they're supposed to be pastoring, or they have been living with the sin of failing to protect the people they're pastoring from other abusers. And it keeps getting found out. And it hurts our message. It hurts our mission. It hurts our ministry among non-Christians because they don't reform themselves. They're out there trying to change the world, and they won't change themselves. So reform yourselves. Don't think, yes, I sinned, but no one will find out, because sin is always found out. Reform starts with you. My final challenge to you is to look for something outside of yourself that needs reform and work to reform it. This can be a donation that you make, a letter that you write. It can be an event that you sign up to volunteer for, a meeting you attend. It cannot be a social media post that you share. It cannot be signing a petition at change.org. No slacktivism. And I don't recommend that you post the 95 Theses on the door of your local Catholic church tonight, because someone has already done that. In fact, 2 someones have done that. But find something real and tangible outside of yourself and participate in it. Don't think that just because you personally did not create a problem, that it's not your problem, that you have no responsibility for it, because that's not the example that Josiah left us. Reform yourself, and then you bring that reform to other people. For a young man, for a young ruler, Josiah was doing pretty good before he encountered Huldah. But he did not stop. God had something else to teach him, and he found it because he was teachable. He was always looking for reform. The reform of Josiah and Huldah, that was way back in the 7th century BC. And the Protestant Reformation, 16th century AD. But the gospel taught by Jesus Christ is that the kingdom of God is among us. The always Reformation is here. The always Reformation is now. So the worship team is going to come up, and then Pastor Peter is going to give the benediction. Thank you.